Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Stella. I'm 30 years old. I have a master's in modern and contemporary literature, and I teach English and drama at a Steiner high school in West London. I'm purposefully not starting with an intro video because when my students are writing essays, I always tell them to write some of their content first before they write their essays so they know what their essay is about and they can introduce it properly. So I am following my own advice, as I should, making some content, and then I will maybe make an intro video later when I've pinned down more precisely what this channel is. I have an idea of what it is. I think I know what it's going to be, but I will find out first. I think I should say up top that this is going to be a pretty spoilerific video and probably a pretty spoilerific channel. I'm talking about readings of texts, how we read text, and things that we can interpret. So I'm going to go into detail. So I'm going to assume as I speak that you know the text or that you don't mind spoilers. So for this first video, I'm going to talk about The Secret Garden. I highly recommend it to anybody. It's a pleasure to read. If you know this text, if you've read it, or if you want to watch this video without reading it, I would go and read a synopsis, because I'm not going to do that. I want to dive into looking at the text and what it's about, so I'm going to assume that you know what's going on. The Wikipedia synopsis of The Secret Garden is actually pretty decent, so go do that. Overall, what the book is really about is about recovering from trauma. It's about recovering from the loss of parents, of a wife, of loved ones. It's about recovering from illness, and it's about recovering from neglect. I think that all the main people, certainly two of the children, Mary and Colin, are strongly suffering from neglect when we meet them. And of course, the garden itself, the titular secret garden, is also recovering from neglect. But I want to do a slightly more specific reading. And as I was reading it, when I finished the book, it struck me that one of the best approaches you could take really is to do a sort of queer reading of The Secret Garden. I'm going to premise this by saying that I don't think there's authorial intention here. I don't think Frances Hodgson Burnett, publishing this in 1911, purposefully was like, I'm going to represent gay and queer people. But she actually does a really good job of it. I'm going to look at this in two aspects. So the first one I'd like to look at is chosen family. To sort of bring us into this, like two gay people in the world, I want to just sort of quote. One is RuPaul on RuPaul's Drag Race. He says, as gay people, we get to choose our family. And I think this is a really, really important part of gay narratives. The other person I wanted to flag up is Dan Savage. I'm a long-time devotee of the Savage love cast. And Dan Savage says that there is your biological family and then there's your logical family. And for most people, there's a lot of overlap in terms of who the people in those groups are. But for some people, there isn't. Some people, biological family is really not logical family. There are a lot of heartbreaking stories about people shunning and throwing out LGBTQ, etc. Family members because they don't agree with their lifestyle. So then, finding people who you do love, who you are sympathy with, I suppose, is really important. So, chosen family. So in The Secret Garden, as I've said, we have these very neglected characters, and the first character who kind of guides us into the story is Mary Lennox. And through the first half of the book, what we really experience is Mary sort of softening and becoming sympathetic and growing to love people and understand them because they are her logical family. So she creates this logical family. When she arrives at Misselthwaite Manor, it's really striking that this place is a house, but it's not a home. It is not a place full of family. And the first person who kind of shows her what family is or treats her like family is Martha. Martha is the maid who is sort of assigned Mary, like she's there to look after Mary a lot of the time. Martha kind of steps over a lot of boundaries, but for Mary that's a really, really good thing, because she treats Mary like family. She's like, come on, eat, go outside, get dressed, I'm not going to dress you, you can dress yourself. And there's a kind of loving, warm but firm tone in her that is a bit like, it's slightly maternal, but I think in their dynamic it's more like a big sister. And Martha also gives Mary's first picture of what a family should be like, because Martha talks about her own family, and Martha's family is this very nurturing. I think there's like 12 children and this wonderful mother who looks after them. The second person that Mary kind of meets in terms of family is Martha's brother, Dickon. Dickon is 12, Mary is 10, and when she meets Dickon, he very quickly becomes a sort of older brother figure. She brings him into the secret garden, which she is keeping secret. She brings him in, and he teaches her how to look after the plants and the animals. He has this amazing connection with animals, and the way that they work alongside each other is very sort of like siblings. The third person is Colin. So Colin is actually Mary's cousin, but and he's much more like her, whereas Dickon is this kind of outdoorsy spirit, nature spirit. Colin is sickly and bedridden. He's actually a more extreme version of Mary. When Mary meets Colin, she kind of does for him as Martha and Dickon have done for her. They have taken these really nurturing roles where they are firm and kind, and they teach her things, and she does that for Colin. She basically is like, stop having tantrums, stop being such a baby, and then she tells him about outdoors, and he doesn't ever really leave the house. He's been advised to by doctors, but he doesn't want to, and she draws him outside with these stories about this garden, and she kind of nurtures him. And I think that in a way where Dickon and Martha are like her older siblings, she becomes like Colin's older sibling. The fourth person, am I on four? Fourth person is Ben Weatherstaff, who is a gardener, and when Mary first meets him, he's really gruff and like short with her and kind of finds her annoying, like everybody does. But he eventually comes into the garden and he becomes kind of one of them, and he starts to work with them, and I think just being allowed into this secret, sort of sacred space makes him a part of this family, because they're kind of together and they're growing and they're doing things and they're laughing, and this is where these children are really coming alive. 5. Mrs. Sowerby. Mrs. Sowerby is Dickon and Martha's mother, this kind of wonderful image of mother that Mary has heard about, and there's this just beautiful description of her coming into the garden, which I think really demonstrates the way in which she is mother. The door in the ivied wall had been pushed gently open, and a woman had entered. She had come in with the last line of their song, and she had stood still, listening and looking at them. With the ivy behind her, the sunlight drifting through the trees and dappling her long blue cloak, and her nice fresh face smiling across the greenery, she was rather like a softly coloured illustration in one of Colin's books. She had wonderful, affectionate eyes which seemed to take everything in, all of them, even Ben Weatherstaff and the creatures and every flower that was in bloom. Unexpectedly, as she had appeared, not one of them felt that she was an intruder at all. Dickon's eyes lighted like lamps. "It's Mother! That's who it is!" he cried, and he went across the grass at a run. I think there are two things in here that specifically demonstrate this strong motherly nature that she has. The first is that she had stood still listening and looking at them. This like parent picture of standing back from your children but watching them in a loving and affectionate way, I think is extremely maternal. And the second thing, of course, is that Dickon says it's Mother. He doesn't say it's my mother, he says it's Mother, like as if she is everyone's mother. She's like the mother figure, and when he runs to her, there's this kind of warmth. Yeah, she is Mother. That's Mrs. Sowerby. This becomes particularly poignant for Colin, and a few pages later we get this. I'm going to read again. It was time for Colin to be wheeled back also, but before he got into his chair, he stood quite close to Susan, that's Mrs. Sowerby, and fixed his eyes on her with a kind of bewildered adoration, and he suddenly caught hold of the fold of her blue cloak and held it fast. "You were just what I wanted," he said. "I wish you were my mother, as well as Dickens." All at once Susan Sowerby bent down and drew him with her warm arms close against the bosom under the blue cloak, as if he had been Dickens' brother. The quick mist swept over her eyes. So again we have her in this incredibly warm, loving, motherly gesture towards Colin, which is particularly poignant, which I will talk about in a minute. But this sweeping him under the cloak and holding her to his bosom, these are just innately motherly qualities. So we have Mary, Martha, Dickon, Colin, Ben, and Mrs. Sowerby already. And then we have Mr. Craven, Colin's father, Mary's uncle. And Mr. Craven is very, very removed throughout the book. And I think that there are questions to be asked about to what extent we can forgive him for the terrible way that he has neglected Colin, and to some extent the way that he ignores Mary. I think that he has truly relinquished a parental role that he has a responsibility to uphold, and that does make him quite complicated to work with. But in the end, he does return, and he comes into this sort of paradisial garden, and he does, embrace his son, and there is a real sense that this father and son have been reunited. And in fact, in the second half of the book, although we are led into the story by Mary, in the second half we turn much more towards Colin. It's apt that the book ends not with Mary, it ends with the servants who are in the house looking out and seeing Mr. Craven and Colin coming towards the house together. I will read. "Across the lawn came the master of Misselthwaite, and he looked as many of them had never seen him, and by his side, with his head up in the air and his eyes full of laughter, walked as strongly and steadily as any boy in Yorkshire, Master Colin." Those are the last words of the book, so I think that really demonstrates how we've turned to Colin's point of view, and that this reunion with Mr. Craven is really important, and a really important part of creating this little garden family. So I'm glad that we've come to Colin, because that leads really easily into my second point. Before I read it, I had a vague memory that for me as a young woman growing up watching the film, which I haven't seen for a very, very long time. So for me there was always like a sort of a tension between, is Mary supposed to love Dick and is she supposed to love Colin? But reading at this time, that is not what I saw at all. I felt very strongly that Mary needed to develop in herself love of human beings more generally, and that she needed family and love and friends. And I think that that's the relationship she has with everyone in the book. Colin, on the other hand, is a little bit different. He too needs to love human beings, to love people, to be surrounded by friends and family and companionship. But unlike Mary, Colin is framed in a much more romantic way. And I think that there are a few ways that we can kind of read Colin as a gay or queer character, in the sort of way that his desire and his outlook and the way that he's written, it's sort of blooming in him as a young person. So first of all, we have to address the less pleasant aspect of this, which is that he is shunned by his father. He is treated as an outcast. He is told that he has an illness, a sickness, that there is something wrong with him. And sadly, that is a very true part of LGBTQ plus narratives. This element of being rejected is often where we start with these narratives, both fictional and non-fictional. And that is very much where we find Colin, sort of other. He is also painted, I think, in this extremely beautiful way, this way that it creates a kind of magnificently romantic aura around him. And I don't think that is necessarily specifically a gay reading or a queer reading, but it is striking that I think the book has quite a female gaze in terms of the fact that it looks at male characters rather than at female characters. It's really interested in looking at male characters. I think that the most important looking happens when characters are looking at Dickon. In this trio of children, Dickon is the exception. We are never with him narratively. We don't know what's happening with him inside, and we don't know. He basically never puts a foot wrong. He is flawless and perfect and wonderful, and that is all anyone says about him and all anyone sees in him, which makes him a very sort of mythological other character, and certainly an object of desire. The animals are literally drawn to him. Actually, I would like to read two passages. I've chosen these passages on the one hand to demonstrate the attraction that Dickon has or causes in everyone and everything that is around him. But also I want to compare a little bit the way that Mary looks at Dickon and the way that Colin looks at Dickon, because I think that the way that Colin looks at Dickon is significantly more about desire and love. So starting with the way that Mary looks at Dickon. She quite caught her breath as she stopped to look at it. A boy was sitting under a tree, with his back against it, playing on a rough wooden pipe. He was a funny-looking boy, about 12. He looked very clean, and his nose turned up, and his cheeks were as red as poppies, and never had Mistress Mary seen such round and such blue eyes in any boy's face. And on the trunk of the tree he leaned against, a brown squirrel was clinging and watching him, and from behind a bush near by, a cock pheasant was delicately stretching his neck to peep out, and quite near him were 2 rabbits sitting up and sniffing with tremulous noses, and actually it appeared as if they were all drawing near to watch him and listen to the strange low little call his pipe seemed to make. I think what's first important to point out is that Mary sees him, and we get her sort of catching her breath at the beginning, but then it becomes purely a description of Dickon and what he's like and how things are drawn to him, and I think it's also important that through Mary's eyes he appears funny looking. He's not beautiful or magical, he's funny looking, and then he has this strange effect on the animals around him. She is obviously enchanted by what she sees, but it's a sort of curiosity and an interest, let's say. I'm going to compare that then with Colin seeing Dickon. Well, I'll read it. It's different. Colin slowly sat up and stared as he had stared when he first saw Mary. But this was a stare of wonder and delight. The truth was that in spite of all he had heard, he had not in the least understood what this boy would be like, and that his fox and his crow and his squirrels and his lamb were so near to him in his friendliness that they seemed almost to be part of himself. Colin had never talked to a boy in his life, and he was so overwhelmed by his own pleasure and curiosity that he did not even think of speaking. So compared with when Mary sees Dickon, that we have this sort of awe and wonder in looking at him, and particularly this interest in the animals being so close to him and being so drawn to Dickon. But with Colin, we also get this self-reflection, this fact that for Colin, something is happening in him, not just in what he's looking at. Colin is having a very strong emotional reaction to looking at Dickon. I think particularly the book says Colin had never talked to a boy in his life, and he was so overwhelmed by his own pleasure and curiosity. I think that this is a really kind of like, it strikes me that this is possibly a real Ring of Keys moment. For those of you who know Fun Home, you know what I'm talking about, but this moment where, as a queer person, Colin looks at someone and recognizes something. And I think it's not just that Dickon is a boy and Colin is a boy, and that is, like self-recognition. There seems to be a particular pleasure and delight in the way that he looks at Dickon. And as they go on in the book, Dickon really helps Colin to walk. He brings him exercises. He's really not just a friend, but like someone who guides and helps Colin to become this upright human being. I mean, upright metaphorically as well as literally, this sort of inward uprightness in him. But I do still think there is a beauty and a tenderness and a romance in the way that Colin looks at Dickon that seems to frame him as potentially desiring something more than friendship. So I could say a lot more about this book, but I'm going to stop there. I could also say a lot more about queer readings of this book, but I think I've done enough. And I hope you found this convincing or interesting. If you violently disagree with me, or you really agree with me and you have evidence for either of those, I would love to hear from you and see how you have read this text and what you took from it. So I'll say goodbye for now. You can follow me on Twitter at Stella Otwell, and Instagram, same, whatever you want.